In this part of the lecture, we're going to continue our discussion of learning. I'm going to introduce and discuss operant conditioning, the ideas of Thorndike and Skinner, and then we're going to briefly discuss how you can use operant conditioning to teach an animal more complex behaviors through a process that's called shaping, or learning through successive approximations. And we're going to end this lecture by discussing operant conditioning in honeybees, and in particular I'm going to discuss an experiment that shows that you can use operant conditioning to teach bees some complex concepts. But let's start with a definition of operant conditioning, right? Operant conditioning allows animals to learn which actions lead to things they want and which are needed to avoid things they don't want, right? So operant conditioning is learning through the consequences of actions. Actions that lead to favorable experiences are repeated in the future, and actions that lead to negative consequences are avoided. And this is also called instrumental conditioning and the law of effect, according to Thorndike. And a simple example of it is when operant conditioning is used to teach a pigeon that pecking at a key, for example, when the key is lit up, will lead to a reward, but when the key is not lit up, it will not lead to a reward. So they can learn this kind of thing very quickly. And we saw this in the previous part. We discussed the law of effect. And Thorndike defined it as follows. Right, responses to a situation that are followed by satisfaction are strengthened, they become more likely. And B, responses that are followed by discomfort are weakened. And although he's given credit for discussing these ideas, we saw something very similar to this when we discussed Morgan and his concept of intelligence. Right, so for Morgan, intelligence is basically operant conditioning, or the law of effect. The difference is that Thorndike studied the law of effect in the lab and developed lab techniques for doing that, while Morgan studied it in his own house. And operant conditioning and the law of effect was also discussed thoroughly by B.F. Skinner. He based his whole career on operant conditioning. His idea, though, was that we shouldn't define it mentalistically. We should just focus on responses and stimuli, right, and the consequences they have. So he didn't talk about an animal getting what it wants or anything like that. So what Thorndike and Skinner have in common is that they both view operant conditioning as a mindless process, right? So for Thorndike and Skinner, there's no planning going on when an animal is learning through operant conditioning, right? There's no foresight. Likewise, Morgan thought that intelligence doesn't involve planning or problem solving, right? So what this means is that, according to all these theorists, when an animal is learning in this way, the animal is simply producing responses randomly. And then the consequences, they notice the consequences, and those consequences make those responses more likely or less likely. So Skinner liked to draw an analogy with natural selection, right? In natural selection, as defined by Darwin, mutations arise randomly, and then the environment non-randomly selects those mutations that are favorable. So likewise, when an animal is learning through operant conditioning, the responses are produced randomly, but the consequences from the environment are not random. Right? They either lead to reinforcement or punishment. And as I said in the introduction, operant conditioning can be used to learn quite complex behaviors, right? And this is through a process called shaping. So shaping refers to acquiring novel, complex behaviors in steps. Right? So animals are rewarded for performing one action, and once they've mastered that action, they only get reinforcement for engaging in the next action as well. Right? So you gradually increase the requirements until the whole behavior is displayed. And this is also referred to as successive approximations. Right? So shaping involves acquiring behavior through successive approximations. Gradually the animal gets to the more and more complex behavior as a result of this process. So what's an example of acquiring a behavior through shaping? Well, this diagram gives a nice example. If you showed up at the very end, for example, you might see a rat that uses the ladder to pull up the ladder to get to the first level, and then it pulls the ladder up to get to the second level, and so on. Right? And you might think, well, wow, how can a simple rat figure this out? And what Skinner showed is that you can get the animal to do something complex like this through shaping. So what might this look like? So you confront the animal with a completed situation, but initially it won't figure out that it has to climb up the ladder, then pull the ladder up, and then climb the ladder once again to get to the top. So to get it to do that, you have to start with something simple, like first rewarding it for simply approaching the ladder. And once it has approached the ladder on the bottom, you may only reward it if it puts a step on one of the rungs. And then once it's doing that consistently to get the reward, you may only reward it for climbing up a couple levels on the ladder, and so on, right? Gradually increasing the requirements until it gets to the top. And then once it gets to the top, it has to, of that first level, it has to figure out to pull the rope up in order to bring the ladder up so that it can climb to the next level. So how do you do that? Well, once it's consistently getting to that next level, you may only reward it for putting a paw on the rope. And then once it's consistently touching the rope or the string, you might only reward it for pulling on it. And then again, gradually increasing the requirements until it pulls the ladder all the way up. And then you give it reinforcement only once it starts to climb that ladder. Okay? So what you're left with at the end is a very complex behavior that's been acquired through a very, in a sense, mindless process. So it doesn't require that the animal have thought through the problem. It doesn't require that the animal figured anything out. It just needs to get shaped for each, just needs to get rewarded for each step in the process. So this is a reminder that complex behavior doesn't always require complex cognitive processes on the part of an animal. And we saw something like that when we discussed instincts. Right? We saw that the wasp can make a very complex nest with lots of parts and components, but what underlies that is a very mindless instinct that's just carried out like a computer subroutine. But I want to end this lecture by discussing how you can use operant conditioning to teach some cognitive concepts, right? In particular, how you can use operant conditioning to teach honeybees, Apis mellifera, the concepts of same and different, right? Sameness and difference as abstract concepts, right? And this has been demonstrated in several studies, but I want to outline the more classic demonstration of this by Gyurfa and colleagues from 2001. More recently, it was replicated by Brown and Syed in 2013 and with bumblebees. So what did Gyurfa and colleagues do? They used a technique that we're going to be discussing several places in this course. right? They used a delayed match to sample and a delayed non-match to sample technique to teach bees the concept of same and different. So what are these techniques? In a delay match to sample technique, an animal is shown a sample stimulus, and then after a certain delay, they're shown two stimuli, and they have to choose the right one. They have to choose the one that matches the sample in order to get a reward. Right? And this is what was done to teach them the concept of same in experiments 1 through 4. And a delay non-match to sample is the opposite. So they see a sample and they get a reward for only choosing the different stimulus, the stimulus that doesn't match the sample. And that's how you teach them the concept of difference. And they did this in experiments 5 through 6. Now, one thing that we have to be wary of is that an animal may learn to respond to a certain stimulus correctly, but that doesn't mean that they've acquired anything abstract, right? That they've learned anything general, like a concept of sameness and difference, right? Because they could simply have learned how to respond to particular stimuli. So, what they say is that bees can be said to have acquired a concept of same and different only if they generalize what they learn to stimuli that are very different from the ones that were originally trained with. Right? So they have to be able to generalize what they learned with a training stimuli to novel stimuli without further training. So that's an important idea, and an idea that we're going to be discussing several times in this course. The need for the transfer stimuli to be different from the training stimuli. And in their study, they used a Y-shaped maze. And at the entrance to the maze, they were shown a sample. And then they enter into a different compartment, and they're shown two choice stimuli. And they get rewarded for entering the correct branch of that Y-shaped maze. So it looks like this. So you see the bee in the bottom, and it enters into compartment A, where they're shown on two sides a particular color 1 or color 2, right? So they're shown only one of those two colors on both sides. And that's the sample stimulus. And then it enters into compartment B, and in compartment B they're shown color 1 and color 2 on two sides. And they have to enter the right branch, either C1 or C2, and D1 or D2, in order to get the reward. Right? And you can see in D1, that's the feeder. Okay? So let's go through their experiments. In experiment 1, which is again used a delayed match to sample. Right, so the sample stimulus on the bottom was a color circle, and this one is the color yellow. And then at the decision point, right, where the two branches come out, they were shown a yellow circle and a blue circle. And they would get rewarded if they went to the branch that had the yellow circle. Alternatively, if they saw a blue circle as a sample, they'd have to go to the branch that had the blue circle in order to get the reward. And in experiment 2, the sample stimulus was again a circle. However, it had a grading pattern, either a vertical or horizontal grading. And then at the decision point, they saw two circles, one with either a vertical or a horizontal grading, and they had to choose the matching one. So in this one, they saw a horizontal grading sample, so they would have to choose the horizontal circle at the choice point. So now we're going to just discuss what happened during the training phase. where they're learning, right, where they're acquiring the concept. So in both experiments 1 and 2, bees learned to choose the matching stimulus. Right? So if they were choosing at chance, it would always be 50-50 as to whether or not they go into the correct branch. But what we can see as the blocks proceed, right, gradually the bees become more and more accurate. So they start to choose greater than chance the correct stimulus. Better than can be expected by chance. But again, this doesn't tell us that they have acquired a concept of same or different, since they could simply have learned how to respond to those particular stimuli. Right? So if bees have acquired a concept of sameness, they should be able to apply it to novel stimuli that they haven't seen before. So this brings us to the transfer trials. Right? So in experiment 1, after being trained with colors, they were tested with grading patterns that they hadn't seen before. So the question is, do they choose right away, without further training, the matching grading trials? And in experiment 2, we saw that they were trained with gradings, and then in the transfer trials, they were presented with the color circles that they hadn't seen before. And again, the question is, do they choose the matching color stimulus right away? Right, so Gyurfa and colleagues recorded the likelihood of choosing the matching versus the non-matching patterns. Now, importantly, during the transfer trials, there were no rewards present, right, because they didn't want to engage in further training. So what are the results of the transfer trials? We see on the left the results for experiment 1, and on the right the results for experiment 2. Right, so for experiment 1, remember they were trained with colors, and now in the transfer trials they see grading patterns. And what we see is that when the sample stimulus was a vertical grading, they tended to choose, they had a preference for, greater than chance, for the vertical grading. And when the sample was a horizontal grading, they had a preference to choose the horizontal grading, showing that they've transferred what they had learned to novel stimuli. And in experiment 2, shown on the right, we see that they transferred what they learned with gradings to colors. So when they're shown a blue sample, they tend to choose the blue circle, and when they're shown the yellow sample, they tend to choose the path marked by the yellow circle. Okay, so clearly they've generalized to novel stimuli. All right, so bees trained with colors generalized to gradings, and bees trained with gradings generalized to colors. All right, so this seems to have taught them the concept of sameness. But this is all restricted within the domain of vision. So the question is, can they transfer across sensory modalities? That would show that they truly have a general concept of sameness. So in experiments 3 and 4, they showed that bees could apply the concept across different sensory modalities, specifically olfaction and vision. So in experiment 3, the bees were trained to match on the basis of color, and then on the transfer tests, they were required to match on the basis of smell. Okay, so at the sample point, they were presented with a scent, and then, like let's say a lemon scent, and then at the choice point, they would be shown with either a lemon scent and a rose scent, and they had to choose the matching scent. In experiment 4, the training occurred with scents, right? And then on the transfer tests, they were presented with colors. And what they found is that in both cases, bees were able to generalize and choose the matching stimulus, even though it was presented in a different modality than what they had originally been trained in. So it is a general concept. Now, that's acquiring the concept of sameness, but what about the concept of different or difference? So this brings us to the last 2 experiments that they did. Now here, during training, they used a delayed non-match to sample task. So in experiment 5, they were shown a sample color disk, like blue or yellow, and then at the choice point, they were again shown two colors, blue and yellow, and they had to choose the one that's different from the sample. And in experiment 6, the bees were presented with circles that had horizontal or vertical gratings, and at the choice point, they had to choose the grading pattern that was different from the one that they had seen as a sample. And what we see for the training phase is that they eventually learn to choose a different stimulus, right, during the training. We can see that it's close to chance for most of the blocks, but then by block 5 and 6, they start to perform better than chance at choosing the different stimulus. But again, we need to show that they can generalize to novel stimuli and that they simply haven't learned how to respond correctly to those particular stimuli. So in the transfer tests, the bees in experiment 5 were presented with grading patterns after being trained with colors, and the bees in experiment 6, having been trained with gradings, were presented with colors. And again, they didn't receive a reward for choosing correctly in experiments 5 and 6 because they didn't want to train them to do this. So the question is, did the bees spontaneously choose the different stimuli? So here's the results for the transfer tests. On the left we have experiment 5 and on the right experiment 6. We can see in experiment 5 when they were trained with colors, and then they went into the transfer trials when they were shown a vertical grading, they had a greater than chance preference for the horizontal grading at the choice point. And when shown as a sample the horizontal grading, they had a greater than chance preference for the vertical grading, showing that they've transferred the concept of difference to novel stimuli. And on the right we see that although they were trained with gradings, they chose the different stimulus for colors. All right, so although operant conditioning is usually described as a mindless process where animals can gradually learn to acquire complex behaviors, in this experiment we've seen that that bees can acquire complex concepts, abstract concepts, right, which are clearly mental things through operant conditioning. And as I said when I first started this experiment, this is the classic one, but this isn't a one-off kind of thing. Several experiments have been done since to try to rule out more deflationary explanations of this phenomenon. Right, so more recently, Brown and Syed in 2013 demonstrated using a different paradigm concepts of sameness and difference in colonies of bumblebees. Now, all of this should strike you as very remarkable, right? That you can teach bees concepts of sameness and difference, since they have such tiny brains, right? Brains that are smaller than a grain of sand. Right? The honeybee brain, for example, only has about 100 million neurons, which is, orders of magnitude smaller than the 100 billion neurons possessed by the human brain. So what this tells us is that you don't need large brains necessarily in order to engage in complex behaviors or even to acquire abstract concepts.